Konstantin, wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining the show.
It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to this.
So many questions. The very first point is you were 3 times a founder. Brief background on this. How come you were a founder 3 times?
Oh, a little bit of a background on this. So, the first company that I founded was a recruitment business. And off the back of the success of that recruitment business, we actually founded a second business that was affiliated to that recruitment business, which was an executive search business. And the third business that I founded was actually a content creation business, which included a video production and podcast production studio. Unfortunately, the timing on that was rather unfortunate because it was right on the cusp of what we now call the pandemic years. And that didn't quite work out. Nevertheless, it was a huge learning, which has actually fueled my interest in content creation and video creation and podcast creation and taught me a lot about all of that world.
What were some of your greatest lessons being a founder in several companies?
People. People first. It doesn't really matter how good your business plan is, how good your strategy is, how good your marketing is, or even your ability as a founder to sell the product. Unless you have the right people in place, unless you're able to attract, engage, hire, and retain the right people on your team, you will forever struggle working in that business rather than scaling and developing that business. So, working on the business. People are the number one blocker here.
Or the number one enabler, if they're the right ones?
Absolutely. People are also the number one enabler if you get it right. Unfortunately, most leaders, most founders don't know how to get it right because, as crazy as it may seem, there are no programs that teach this. It's assumed that you are promoted to becoming a manager and all of a sudden you know how to hire people, you know how to identify what are the gaps in your team, you know how to define the right questions to ask to gather the information that you need in order to make an effective hiring decision. And that's not the case. It simply doesn't work that way, unfortunately. And the statistics also show us that this is a huge problem because half the hires, nearly half the hires that are made by managers leave the organization within 18 months of joining. And that is a huge drag on time, productivity, impact on team, impact on culture, and of course, a tremendous cost.
That's true too. It's something that I realized recently in terms of the importance because I heard Stephen Bartlett. Well, first of all, he mentions it a lot on his podcast, Diary of
Mhm.
CEO, but also I saw him speak at Tech Arena in Stockholm, and he spoke very strongly about the importance of hiring and hiring correctly, and how that was the number one thing in running a successful business. And I know that you talk about the art and the science of hiring. So why the art and why the science of hiring?
Well, there's two elements to this. Yes, we can make hiring about a scientific process, and there are certain elements of hiring that should be scientific. After all, hiring is an exercise in evidence gathering. You need to understand what is the context, and you need to understand what evidence you need to gather in order to identify who will be able to operate best and deliver the outcomes within your context, the context of your organization, no matter what that organization is. That's the scientific part. The art part is understanding that we are dealing with people. We're not hiring drones, we're not hiring robots, we're dealing with people. And people are creative, they have soft skills, they have their tremendous powers, and they also have Well, they're fallacies. Understanding how to navigate this and what you can accept within your organization, within the context that you're hiring for, and what outcomes you want these people to deliver in order to be successful in their role is also an art form. You can execute interviews as a list of questions and make candidates feel absolutely terrible going through that. You could also ask very much the same questions, but in a way that contextualizes those questions and provides candidates with information about you as a manager, your organization, where you're heading, and communicate your intent through the hiring process in a way that will enable people to understand, is this the right place for me? Is this the right place for me to dedicate the next years of my career to grow, to develop, to be promoted, to enable my own progress in the direction that I am interested in? And there is an art to that, same as there is an art to leadership. After all, hiring is a huge part of leadership.
What are some of the greatest pitfalls? What are some of the mistakes that are done? So you mentioned one of them, which is just having a bunch of questions without any context. But what are some of the other core mistakes that people do when they're hiring?
The first mistake is poorly defining why you are hiring. It's very easy to take a job description that you used for this job or your competitor has posted online, doctor it up a little bit, and that job description ends up being a list of tasks, responsibilities, and hard skills. Maybe with some nice fluffy language around alignment and responsibility and being a exceptional leader without actually defining what that is. It's surprising how often, when asked, why is it that you need to make this hire, people are not able to articulate what it is, what is the reason behind it. In my experience of taking founders and leaders through a framework I call the hiring blueprint, the first part of that framework is to identify what is the mission or the purpose of the job, and do so in a language that could be understood by my 11-year-old daughter. A lot of leaders have a vision for the job, but struggle to articulate that. By not articulating that in a precise way, they're setting themselves up for hiring failure. Because without articulating this, people around them that are involved in the hiring process don't understand what it is that you're trying to achieve by making this hire. And one thing I have also noticed is that probably 25 to 30% of hiring blueprints result in those leaders realizing, actually, wait on, I don't need to make this hire. I already have the right person on my team. I just need to provide them with some more skills, some more coaching, some more development in order to lift them up to that position. And what I actually need to hire for is someone that will take over these responsibilities, these outcomes that this person is delivering right now, so that this person can be elevated and the headcount I bring in will have an impact on that as well. So it's a case of succession planning rather than just, oh, I need a new engineering manager or I need a new sales manager. The best candidates you have are often the people that already work for you. And interestingly, if you do that consistently, people will be happier in their jobs. And if they're happier in their jobs, they will stay longer. And the longer people stay and are engaged in the work that they do, the more productive they become. Thus, the average productivity per employee in your organization goes up. Thus, you have a high performance organization, a high performance team. And you're able to work on the business rather than in the business.
What you're essentially saying is by having that clarity, it enables them to realize that they have the right person. And if you promote more and work more with the people that are already there, more engagement, more productivity, more retention, less need to hire, costs go down, which all makes perfect sense. But I'm thinking, what about a startup that suddenly is scaling up and needs to hire 50 people overnight or 100 people overnight? What can they put in place in order to have strategic hiring and be really clear about it? Because I've also heard that this is a common mistake, that they hire too fast or that they're not as effective because it's maybe their first proper real big hiring turn.
Absolutely. So if you realize overnight that you need to hire 50 people, you've done something wrong.
Okay, maybe not 50, maybe 10. I'm just thinking of these startups that scale really quite quickly, or they suddenly
Yes.
get funding and they realize that they need 10, 20 new people.
And realistically, the days of that type of hiring are over for the time being. That type of scaling came into play with big investments, usually VC investments, a significant seed or a Series A investment. It's also the reason why, with seed and Series A investments, between 70 and 90% of the funds deployed are spent on people and hiring, or traditionally were spent on people and hiring. The type of hiring that requires such volume, such pace of hiring should actually be planned out. It should be planned out in advance. And generally, when you are raising funds from VCs, they will want to see a plan for scaling your team. So you should have a clear realization of when do I need to bring who onto the organization. Having said that, it doesn't always happen this way. That would be the ideal world. And before you jump into posting ads and interviewing candidates and going down the route of we'll know it when we see it, take a pause, take a breath, and think about what it is that you actually want to achieve by making these hires. A huge problem is that hiring at that stage is done from the perspective of we have a problem today, right now, this very moment, and we need to hire someone to solve this problem today. But there's a fallacy here. You cannot hire your way out of a problem you have today. Because even if the perfect candidate comes in today and is able to start work today, you're still going to need time to onboard them, to explain your business to them. And let's say you are fantastic at this and your organization is small enough and they can reach productivity within 2 to 3 months. Well, that's tremendously fast. They're still not able to deal with the problem that you had 2 to 3 months ago. They can deal with the problem that you have in 2 to 3 months. And usually, actually, the time to full productivity is 6 months. So when you're hiring, you need to be thinking, okay, what are the challenges that we expect to be overcoming in the next 3, 6, 12, 18 months, and hire for that. If you need someone to come in and solve a problem today, right now, then, well, you either have to do it with the people you already have, or identify if there are any specific points that you can bring on a freelancer to deal with right now. Sure, it's a little bit more expensive. But this hiring for today's problem then has a further impact. Because you're hiring for today's problem without an understanding how this person will be developing within your organization, 12 months down the line, you realize, oops, the person we hired is not the person that can deliver the impact we need now. And we didn't hire the person that is interested in dealing with those challenges, in dealing with that scale that we're going after. And the result of that is that you have a mishire, which means you have to go back to the drawing board and make another hire. And sure, there's the, hire slow, fire fast mentality that we can bring into this. But if you're a scaling startup, you don't have the time to hire slow, and you definitely don't want the impact of firing fast. So take the time, define what it is that you want to achieve by making this hire. What are the outcomes that this person needs to achieve for you to be happy, to be satisfied that they are the right person for the job? And then hire from that. Because the cost of those mishires is tremendous. The cost of a replacement hire, according to a study done by Gallup in 2023, is 2 times the annual salary of the person you're replacing. And that doesn't even take into consideration the fact that this also has an impact on not only productivity and time, but also on profit and lost opportunity. And actually, G.H. Smart did a study in the early 2000s, and once they added opportunity, cost of opportunity and profit, that number could skyrocket up to 15 times annual salary. So all of a sudden, you're spending millions on making rehires, which you could have avoided by simply sitting down and taking an hour or 90 minutes with your team to define, okay, what do we want to achieve by making these hires specifically? And by when? And how?
Being smart and strategic and not acting too quickly, and being able to measure also the consequences of those hires. I love this approach of, if you hire someone now, they'll be able to deliver the work properly, effectively, productively 3 months or even 6 months later. It just shows our society's tendency to act in urgency, which I often speak about because of deep work and working on the actual needle movers. But often the needle movers are things like hiring. One thing that I'm wondering about, talking about the actual hiring process this time, how much do you take into account personality types, for instance, for different roles? What's your view on this? Because there's obviously task, outcomes, responsibilities, the actual experience that they have, maybe their degree and background, though probably their soft skills make the biggest difference. I'm curious about your perspective on this.
Okay, so let's go back to the hiring blueprint, because it's a relatively simple framework with 3 elements to it. Element number 1, as we've established, is a mission statement or a purpose. Element number 2 is outcomes. What do you need these people to accomplish, to achieve, to deliver? What are the goods that they're delivering within a specific time frame? The third element is competencies. What are the competencies that you expect someone to use in order to deliver these outcomes? Now, competencies are important for a number of reasons. First of all, competencies are what enables you to assess whether someone will fit into the culture that you have, the snapshot of the culture you have. They also allow you to add into that culture the competencies that will build the culture that you aspire to have as an organization. So this covers us for the fit and add, and also adaptability, which oddly enough is the highest indicator of long-term performance within an organization for an individual. Someone's personality type can change over time. However, someone's interest, ability, mindset, and way of delivering the outcomes is something that will be reflected in their personality types, in interviews, and how they resonate with the competencies that you require for the job. And if you do this right, in competency-based interviews, guess what they're based on? Those competencies that you're outlining. And asking the right questions that are focused on those competencies that you need in order for someone to deliver the outcomes within your business will ultimately align their personality type with what your organization needs, not only now to fit, but also add in order for you to grow.
What are some of the questions that are overused and not useful? And what are some of the questions that are maybe underused and very insightful?
I actually really dislike questions about questions, because interview questions need to be specific to the context that you're hiring for. So while there are certain questions that I really do like in an interview, and some questions that I really hate in an interview, and I think that whoever uses them should not be anywhere near a hiring decision, I do think that questions need to be specific to the job, and they need to be designed in such a way that each interview is repeatable, so you can assess candidates on a level playing field. Questions that I absolutely despise is, tell me about yourself. It is overused. It is completely nonsensical. It actually tells the candidate you didn't even bother to prepare, sends the wrong message. And what you will get is a rehearsed answer that will provide you with no valuable insights other than, has someone rehearsed an answer or not? It's a terrible question to ask, sets up an interview completely the wrong way. We also need to mention here that interviews are mutually beneficial conversations. Yes, you are interviewing a candidate. You're not interrogating them. But the candidate is also interviewing you. In fact, the candidate is interviewing you for a more important job. They're interviewing you for the job of manager, leader, career coach, employer. They're interviewing you for multiple jobs. And unless you set up interviews to reflect that that conversation needs to be mutually beneficial, and that your job as an interviewer is to facilitate a mutually beneficial, mutually informative conversation, you're missing a trick. A much better question to ask in an interview is to actually balance the interview from the get-go and inform candidates, listen, this is a conversation that is here for both of us to understand how we could work together and whether this makes sense. So I'd like to start the interview with your questions. What questions do you have for me? And in my experience of some 15,000 interviews at this point, that question tells you more about where the candidate sits in regards to this job than almost any other question you can ask in the interview. It'll tell you everything about their preparation, their priorities, their research, their mindset, their interests. It'll open up interesting points that you can revert back to during the conversation. So that would probably be my favorite question, but it's not the only one for sure. Again, it depends on the context.
That's a fascinating point. It's so interesting, the amount of things that would come through that specific question, getting them to open up and ask their questions first. I really like that. That makes a lot of sense.
One thing you do have to be very careful with here, though, is the candidates I love are the ones that take out their notebook and they have a list of 20 questions for me. That's great. They're no questions about the preparation, but you also do need to get specific questions regarding the job in. So if you will be tying back to certain questions they're asking, inform them. Listen, great question. I actually will be addressing this in a question that we've got further on, and we can discuss it in more detail. But you take a note of it and then you revert back to this. But it sets up a pattern for a conversation that yet structured, but understands that there's a balance.
What are some of the great skills that are required in order to become excellent, outstanding at hiring?
You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. There's a reason for it. Listen twice as much as you speak. The second skill, master the art of the follow-up question. Your questions are only as good as the follow-ups you ask afterwards.
Why?
If you ask a question and you get an answer for it, you're just exploring the surface. By asking the right follow-up questions, you're actually diving deeper into those experiences. So let me give you an example here. There is the typical STAR methodology line of questioning. This is a typical competency-based interview methodology, which is situation, task, action, results. This is the type of question where you go, can you tell me about a situation where you had to deal with a difficult team member? Okay, now, what was the task that you were working on? Provide me with the context. Usually people that are making it up are going to already start struggling here. But let's say they're not making it up. You say, okay, wonderful. Can you tell me what actions did you take in that situation given the task that you were working on? How do they think? How do they act? What is it that they do? Wonderful. What were the results of that? Was it a good result, bad result? How do you identify? How do you measure good, bad? And then the question that you can follow up after that is, within our company, we intend to deliver X outcome. Given what you learned from that situation and how you dealt with that situation, how would you apply those learnings into our context to deliver this?
Interesting. So both being clear on the initial questions, but also having really pointed follow-up questions that are linked. I like this STAR framework and seeing how they all tie together. What is something that surprised you? You've done thousands of interviews throughout the years, and what are some things that have surprised you overall, maybe about either people hiring or the people looking maybe to apply for a job? What have been some things that have surprised you?
How many people think they can wing it? And that's both sides of the spectrum here. That's truly surprising to me. The other thing that I find is not only surprising, it's shocking, is how few managers and leaders have had any training around the topic of hiring. According to a research study by SHRM, Society of Human Resource Management, 83% of managers say that hiring the right people at the right time is within the top 3 concerns in the business. And yet, only 23% of managers have ever had any training around the topic of hiring. And that training is generally the basics of competency-based interviewing, an understanding of what are illegal questions, and bias recognition. That's it. And yet we know that people are the foundation of any great organization. There's a huge disconnect here. And I fail to understand why that is the case. People are what drives business forward. That's what drives high performance teams. That's what delivers the results that we need for our organizations to grow, prosper, scale, and become truly fantastic. And yet I am one of 3, 4 people in the world that actually does training specifically for executive and leadership teams on how to hire that goes beyond just how to interview.
I think it comes down to the fact that people totally overestimate their abilities to be great at interviewing for hires. They underestimate the challenge of it, they underprepare, and they overestimate their own abilities and skills.
I think that's not only about hiring.
Full stop.
Full stop.
Perhaps. Okay, we're already approaching the last few minutes of today's interview. What would you say, what piece of advice would you give to someone who's listening to this and maybe they're looking to hire now or in the next month? What would be some advice that you would give to them?
Aside from subscribing to my newsletter, where I do actually share a lot of this information, so for shameless plug here, newsletter.schoolofhiring.com, I would seriously spend some time educating yourself around it. There's some fantastic books out there. There's Patty McCord's Powerful. There is a number of books by Lou Adler that I would highly recommend. But build an understanding of how important hiring is for your organization for the success, and leave your ego at the door. The decision to make a hire is the single biggest, most impactful decision that you can make for your business, for your team. Give it the time and space to have the impact that you need it to have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Konstantin. It's been such a joy. It has flown by. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom. Highly recommend either following you on LinkedIn or signing up to the newsletter. And given you're one of the only people in the world that really, really focuses and goes in depth on this, it sounds like it's definitely something that everyone can benefit from. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.